Hello and most welcome to 1223 of the Heidegger series. We will today discuss constructive mathematics as it is depicted in an article by Lerman of 1989, published in the magazine Mathematics and Mathematics Education. I took it up because I think it's a very comprehensive article. Just going to put my microphone in a second. Constructivism, Mathematics and Mathematics Education. Abstract. Learning theories such as behaviorism, Piagetian theories and cognitive psychology have been dominant influences in education this century. This article discusses and supports the recent claims that constructivism is an alternative paradigm that has rich and significant consequences for mathematics education. In the United States, there is a growing body of published research that claims to demonstrate the distinct nature of the implications of this view. There are, however, many critics who maintain that this is not the case and that the research is within the current paradigm of cognitive psychology. The nature and tone of dispute certainly at times appears to describe a paradigm shift in the Kuhnian model. In an attempt to analyze the meaning of constructivism as a learning theory and its implications for mathematics education, the use of the term by the intuitionist constructivism in learning theory does not bring with it the same ontological commitment as the intuitionists' use of the term, and that it is in fact a relativist thesis. Some of the potential consequences for the teaching of mathematics of a relativist view of mathematical knowledge are discussed here. Constructivism has been described by Kirkpatrick, 1997, as consisting of two hypotheses. One, knowledge is actively constructed by the cognizing subject, not passively received from the environment. Two, coming to know is an adaptive process that organizes one's experiential world. It does not discover an independent, pre-existing world outside the mind of the knower. The first of these is becoming general accepted, certainly by mathematics educators, and is seen to be a useful and productive hypothesis when thinking about listening to children and the mathematical learning. The second is more controversial, perhaps worrying, since it appears to lead us immediately into problems on two levels. Firstly, whether it is ever possible to understand what anyone else is saying or meaning. That is, problems of private languages. And secondly, what kind of meaning can thus be given to what we all accept as known. That is, the nature of knowledge in general and of mathematical knowledge in particular. One might suggest that we content ourselves with hypothesis 1, call ourselves weak constructivists, or more pejorative term, trivial, and leave debate of hypothesis 2 to philosophers and conferences. With the implication that it is not really relevant to the business at hand, the teaching of mathematics. Those accepting both hypotheses have been called radical constructivists. This is rather unsatisfactory, though, since the connections between hypothesis 1 and 2 seem to be quite strong. After all, in mathematics and in philosophy, we are accustomed to pursuing the consequences of an hypothesis, despite their sometimes disturbing nature. In fact, it is crucial that the second hypothesis is considered here precisely because of the significance of the nature of mathematical knowledge. For epistemology and philosophy in general, from Plato through Descartes, Leibniz and Kant to modern philosophers, mathematical knowledge has served two essential functions at least. First, the ultimate test of the adequacy of philosophical ideas proposed is whether they can include and explain mathematical truths. Second, the apparently timeless, certain a priori tautological nature of mathematical propositions form the paradigm of knowledge. If one can establish the validity of propositions about justice, good, or freedom with the kind of certainty that mathematical propositions appear to exhibit, the classical problems of philosophy can be fixed. Thus, it is often the case that philosophers begin with mathematical knowledge. And constantly refer to mathematical concepts at the heart of their ideas. Plato increasingly used mathematical forms to characterize his theory, perhaps because there seem to be so many different forms of, for instance, table. Leibniz's success with his notation for the calculus led to the proposal that such a notation should be developed for all reasons. And Kant characterized space and time as transcendental categories. Development in science in the last 3 centuries have reinforced the role of mathematics as the last bastion of certainty. If, however, one can present a case for the fallibility and relativity of mathematical knowledge and of such concepts as proof and truth, this has fundamental implications for philosophy. Bloor, 1976, was so successful in proposing his relativistic thesis, which focused on mathematics and logics. That debate about his ideas have drawn in many of the major British philosophers today. One way out, discussed and criticized in depth by Stowe, is to continue as before, but surround words such as proof, truth, etc. with inverted commas as proof and truth. In that way, we can slightly weaken our claims in mathematics, but continue to use familiar words. It is if we are saying this is true within the confines of present notions of truth, or it can be taken to mean that the term is completely devalued. This demonstrates how Popper, Lakatos, Kuhn and Feyerabend use inverted commas, and puts forward the thesis that all 4 philosophers are in fact irrationalists, as seen by their use of punctuation. I will return to this issue below, but a comment on Bloor's 82 is relevant here. Comment is relevant here on Bloor's behalf, although he gives it in a different context. Are believers in a flat earth the only ones amongst us with the right to operate with the distinction between up and down? Both weak and radical constructivism are concerned with learning theory and find their modern roots in Piaget's genetic epistemology. However, Piaget was attempting to resolve the ancient problems of how one comes to know anything, and the relationship between the individual and an objective world, and was proposing an alternative to empiricism or Platonism. Thus the question that were amongst those asked and discussed at the 11th International Conference on the Psychology of Mathematics Education. What does constructivism imply for mathematics? And does it have any implications for mathematics education arise directly? Much concern and disquiet has been expressed in recent years with the rigidity, appropriateness, and applicability of Piagetian stages of development. I suggest that part of Piaget's motive in constructing his elaborate theories of mental schema was his desire to establish objectivity. Since his epistemological alternative to empiricism and Platonism places the roots of knowledge in the individual and thus borders on private thoughts and language. I will attempt to show that radical constructivism returns to genetic epistemology, but takes the full consequences of Piaget's philosophy without feeling the need to establish objectivity in this sense. In this article, I will examine what radical constructivism might mean in mathematics and propose some implications for mathematics education. In the former discussion, I will suggest that the present use of the word constructivism has some similarities with its historical use in connection with intuitionism, but is fundamentally different. I will then go on to propose that radical constructivism is a relativist epistemology which does not leave us unable to say anything to each other, but actually endows philosophical discussions with content and controversy. In the latter discussion, I will not avoid the issue of connections between theory and practice. I will not avoid the issue of connections between theory and practice in the sense of the question, how can different epistemologies lead to distinct and testable hypotheses for the teaching of mathematics? Constructivism in mathematics. 1. Constructivism in intuitionism. In the philosophy of mathematics, constructivism is usually used in connection with intuitionism. Indeed, Klein uses the terms interchangeably. I will call this constructivism C1. While the origins of intuitionist ideas in mathematics can be traced back at least to Kronecker 1823 to 1891, and perhaps to Descartes, one looks to Brouwer, whose doctoral dissertation on the foundations of mathematics was written in 1907 for the essence of this epistemological position. A clear description of the use of this notion of constructivism is given by Whale in 1963. An existential statement such as there exists an even number is not considered a proposition in the proper sense that asserts a fact. An infinite logical summation, such as is called for by a statement of this kind, for instance, 1 is even, or 2 is even, or 3 is even, or ad infinitum, is evidently incapable of execution. That is, 2 is an even number. This is a real proposition, provided even has been defined recursively. There exists an even number is nothing but a propositional abstract derived from that proposition. If I consider an insight a valuable treasure, then the propositional abstract is merely a document indicating the presence of a treasure without disclosing its location. Its only value may lie in the fact that it causes me to look for the treasure. It is a worthless piece of paper as long as it's not endorsed by a real proposition such as 2 is an even number, and whenever nothing but the possibility of a construction is being asserted, we have no meaningful proposition. Only by virtue of an effective construction and executed proof does an existential statement acquire meaning. In any of the numerous existential theorems in mathematics, what is valuable in each case is not the theorem as such, but the construction carried out in its proof. Without it, the theorem is an empty shadow. Clearly there are already differences between this notion of constructivism C1 and the one which is discussed today in mathematics education, with which I shall call C2. The epistemology of intuitionists focuses on what mathematics ought to be, which methods, statement, proofs, etc. are acceptable in the construction of mathematics in order to achieve the certainty that was sought by these philosophers of mathematics. Genetic epistemology, the origins of the present notions, C2. Genetic epistemology, the origins of the present notion C2, focuses on the activity of construction as the process by which the individual learns and by which knowledge is created. Mathematics as such is taken for granted by Piaget. His concern was not with valid or invalid mathematical statements, but with how the individual gains that knowledge. There are some similarities also. Heiting 56 in Ben Saref and Putnam in 64 writes in a manner that sounds much like the speech of constructivists today. The following: a mathematical theorem expresses a purely empirical fact, namely the success of a certain construction. 2 plus 2 equals 3 plus 1 must be read as an abbreviation for the statement, I have affected the mental constructions indicated by 2 plus 2 and by 3 plus 1, and I have found that they lead to the same result. The role of language is one of the distinguishing features between C1 and C2. For intuitionists, language is secondary to thought and only serves to communicate that thought to others. Thought, which is right intuition, is the answers, and language is an imperfect device for communication. I will discuss more fully below what essential function language might serve in an elaboration of C2. But briefly, a concept is identified by its use. It gains its meaning from the shared interpretation, which is its use, and hence language, which itself is socially negotiated and finds its meaning only in its use, is integrally connected with the notion of a concept. Other major differences are revealed in an examination of the ontology of the intuitionists. As with C2, the intuitionists do not rely on a notion of transcendental existence. Yes. Of mathematical entities. They maintain that there may be such objects that exists independent of acts of human thought, but their existence is guaranteed only insofar as they can be determined by thought. Faith is a transcendental existence. Unsupported by concepts, must be rejected as means of a mathematical proof. Heiting in Ben Saref and Putnam 1964. Similarly, faith in the existence of a real objective world without establishing some means of connecting it must be rejected as providing us with certainty. However, it is just this certainty that distinguishes C2 from C1. The program of the intuitionist was the Euclidean one of resolving the problems in the foundations of mathematics and establishing the certainty of mathematical knowledge. They maintain that one must reject claims to transcendental existence, but they needed some certain foundations from which to build the structure of mathematics with constructive proofs. Their method, in fact, was to weaken but not reject Kantian intuitionism, which relied on transcendental categories of time and space, and which had been fundamentally threatened by the invasion of non-Euclidean geometries by abandoning Kant's a priority of space, but adhering the more resolutely to the a priority of time. They then appeal to intuition of integers as the basal intuition of mathematics. Kronecker is said to have declared in and after dinner speech, God made the integers, all the rest is the work of God, end of quote. It is interesting to note that Brouwer, Eiting and their supporters were known as radical intuitionists, whereas others were prepared to accept, for instance, the real numbers rather than just integers as God-given and the rest as human construction. Whether this latter was known as weak intuitionists or trivial intuitionists, I do not know. To summarize, C1 has similarities to C2 in that both reject transcendental knowledge of the real world as providing proof and are content to leave its existence an open question. Both assert the centrality of the notion of construction in concept formation and indicate the little value of pure existence theorems, whether in mathematical statements or concepts. The fundamental difference is that intuitionism is an epistemology of mathematical knowledge. Concerned with the program to establish the certainty of mathematics based on the a priority of time and subsequently of the integers to be grasped by intuition. C2 is, in my interpretation, a more complete and consistent view of coming to know of knowledge and of mathematics. The second thing here, second rule, constructionism, C2, and mathematics. For the intuitionists, as for the logicists and the formalists at the time, Certainty was the aim. They were trying to achieve a revised Euclidean program for mathematics, which of course had implications for knowledge in general, since mathematics was seen as the last bastion of the absolutists. C2 has no such teleology. It is not a philosophy built on trying to achieve certain goals. It suggests that we examine the consequences honestly of hypothesis 2 above, that coming to know does not discover an independent pre-existing world outside the mind of the knower. What then does coming to know discover? What is meant by coming to know? If the second constructivist hypothesis implies that there is no world outside the mind of the knower, an implication that many seem to assume, then we are certainly all doomed to solipsism. However, I suggest that this is not the case. The second hypothesis recognizes experience. It does not cause doubt on the idea that we all interact in some way with people. In the world around us, when we ascribe meaning and significance, when we interpret and attempt to explain, when we propose theories based on those experiences, we are organizing our experiential world. The hypothesis implies that we are not discovering the way the world works, in the sense that America was there and inhabited and then discovered by Europeans or whoever. In fact, we cannot talk about the way the world actually, certainly, and in a timeless way works, simply because we cannot have knowledge that we are describing is just what it is. There is no Archimedean position from which to view our concepts and theories, but this has always been the case, and it has not halted people from developing theories, discussing explanatory power, or comparing evidence. Far from making one powerless, I suggest that research from a radical constructivist position is empowering. If there are no grounds for the claim that a particular theory is ultimately the right and true one, then one is constantly engaged in comparing criteria of progress, truth, refutability, etc., whilst comparing theories and evidence. This enriches the process of research. When it is accepted that the knowledge we have on the world or have of the way the world works is not forced upon us by the world, empiricism, nor do we have this knowledge innately, Platonism, then what we know becomes conjecture, theory, and hypothesis. It may may be a well-established conjecture. It may even be just about conceivable that things could be otherwise. But this still does not provide certainty, and all our deductions and reasoning must just accordingly. Further, the theories, concepts and constructs are culturally and temporally relative. One need only think of the Greek notion of the center of the earth being the center of the universe, or the modern creationist interpretations of the development of life to illustrate this. Thus, I suggest that what has to be abandoned with this rejection of the belief that we are discovering an independent pre-existing world outside the mind of the knower is only that the knowledge we can in any way be described as certain and ultimately true. What we lose is certainty and absoluteness. We do not lose the whole purpose in searching. There is still the possibility of making judgments, of using terms such as true and false, up and down, and better or worse, or mere more or less fruitful, etc. And I will clarify in what sense one can use these terms below. Certainty is perhaps only a psychological necessity, or an emotional necessity, not a logical one in any sense. Loss of certainty means that different theories and conjectures are comparable, examinable, and equally valid until one establishes some acceptable criteria of better. Certainty has a tendency to lead one to say, that's it, no more discussion, we have the answer. Fallibilism, a view that accepts the potential refutation of all theories and counterexamples to all concepts, allows one to ask, how does one know that this answer is better than that one? What might constitute a notion of better, might they not both be possible, as with Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometries, or the arithmetists with or without the continuum hypothesis? I have attempted to demonstrate the radical Constructivism as I interpret it. It is a relativist epistemology. I have suggested that it does not leave us unable to use the terms truth and falsity, for instance, or make the whole question, the whole process of investigation worthless. It is perhaps an interesting empirical question where the scientists, or in our case mathematicians, find relativism an empowering philosophy within which to work, or whether they find a form of Platonism more fruitful. One of the ways in which we may justify preferring one theory or explanation over another is the comparative fruitfulness of those theories. Of course, these notions are themselves problematic, and I have different interpretations in different paradigms. But this is not the place to discuss these issues. I have engaged in the debate elsewhere in suggesting that this question, whether mathematicians find one theory more empowering than another, is an interesting one for research. I wish to indicate that the relativist thesis, to be consistent, must be reflexive. That is, to adapt a critical and fallibilist position on relativism itself. One of the criticisms, misguided I believe, that Kilpatrick made of the radical constructivists was that they were not reflexive in their advocacy of what I had described as relativism. The relativist position poses difficult questions, particularly in relation to mathematics, amongst which are the following. A. How can one account for the apparent successes of mathematics? After all, buildings generally stay up, satellites reach their destinations, arithmetic, even with impredicative definitions, seem to work. B. Feyerabend claims that anything goes, including astrology, creationism, etc. Is there a way of preferring? C. Can there be communication? Or are all languages and concepts private? First, as a general comment, it is my view that one consequence of abandoning certainty and accepting fallibilism is that questions such as these are generated, and this in itself as support for the relativist program. One can suggest that A gives clear evidence of the mathematical theories being true, in the sense of correspondence with the real world. It is certainly one of the wonders of mathematics, and one of the best teachers of these phenomena in recent years has been Professor Maurice Klein. Thus, it is instructive to read the final chapter in his Mathematics, The Loss of Certainty, from 90, where he surveys the comments of the great mathematician and scientist on this enterprise. He and they confirm the thesis of his book, that one can only express wonderment and a sense of the power of the human invention which many do in almost mystical and religious terms. But this still doesn't make it possible, or indeed necessary, to claim any absolute truth for the theories. After all, there are revolutions even in mathematical thought. On the other hand, Feyerabend's claim that anything goes results from this, in my view, justified rejection of any absolute criteria for preferring one theory from another. We can give up absolute criteria, however, and still claim that the mathematics progress, or that one theory is to be preferred to another, even if only in hindsight, by accepting the relativism of such criteria. In relation to the scientific and cultural community in which they arise. To return to Stowe's critique of Popper, Kuhn, Feyerabend and Lakatos as irrationalists, and that in what they defend they are led to irrationalism, in the sense that, for instance, Popper holds on to a progression towards truth, Lakatos to the rational reconstruction of scientific history, despite the rejection of certainty. Stowe goes on to reject all their ideas because they are irrationalist, and to develop an alternative empiricist epistemology that provides the certainty that Stowe requires. However, pointing out their inherent irrationalism can also lead to a strengthening of the relativist thesis that forms such a large part of Popper's and Lakatos' work. And yet is opposed by their total programs. C2 as a relativist thesis does not imply that we cannot use cognitive terminology, merely that we have to refer terms such as truth and proof, and better to a particular philosophical frame of reference. Finally, on the question of ontology, or what is, again, certain knowledge of an objectively existing real world cannot be achieved. This is not to deny that the real world exists, only that even if it does, we can have no way of having knowledge of it if we demand that this knowledge has to be certain and absolute. As discussed above, neither the empiricist answer nor the Platonist one are adequate. One can pursue this ultimately to Descartes' cogito ergo sum, but only if one is searching for an absolute knowledge. Objectivity rests in the public nature of language, of concepts, of theories, and hence of knowledge. These can change as they are social constructions, publicly negotiated concepts, but relative to a particular culture, in a time and a place, they function as objective knowledge without ascribing to them a transcendental existence. Bloor's highly illuminating discussion of objectivity takes the issue to the heart of mathematics, that we mean by the existence of mathematical objects. Bloor, 1977. I will continue in 2024 about this. I will just tell my take on it, and my take is it is rather amazing how much work has been put into sort of proving mathematics, and of course the constructivist viewpoint that mathematics works, therefore use it, is the more sane, rather than going the way of Platonists and claiming and some sort of absolute reality for the mathematical objects. It's even hard to see what the reason for that objectification would be. I cannot really see it. It doesn't further the point. It is like hanging a cart before the end, putting the horse beyond, after the cart, I think the expression is. It seems unnecessary, doesn't bring anything to the point, and it doesn't further anything at all. But it is rather typical for the Western fixation of constructing extra things. Therefore, it's still rather interesting. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.